The House Rules Committee held a hearing on the Inflation Reduction Act on Wednesday. The legislation is a scaled-down version of the Build Back Better bill. The act is a large investment in making healthcare and prescription drugs more affordable, fighting climate change, and taxing wealthy corporations. During Wednesday's hearing, Congressman Ed Perlmutter voiced his support for the bill. The Colorado Democrat specifically praised lowering the cost of prescription drugs. Perlmutter said, quote, "Negotiating the drug prices, that by itself is enough to support this particular piece of legislation. That is a huge step forward for America."
I yield to Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm proud to support this bill. It's something, it has pieces that I have campaigned on for 16 years, and I'm going to be very proud to have voted on it before I retire from. I want to start with negotiating the drug prices. I mean, that by itself is enough to support this particular piece of legislation. That is a huge step forward for America. So I don't know if any of our panelists want to talk about that a little bit, but that is something that has been needed for decades. So Mr. Pallone, I see you nodding your head. You may want to comment on it, but I want to talk about that and the affordable, continuing to provide the subsidies for low income earners to the Affordable Care Act. So if you might comment on both of those.
Well, thank you, Mr. Perlmutter. Let me just say, I listened to the ranking member, and we agree on so many things. So I hate to be so contrary here, but I have to be honest. I mean, when she had the dialogue with Mr. Cole and they talked about HR 19, which is the Republican alternative, it really isn't. As I said before, the one thing that is missing is negotiated prices, and everyone will tell you that the main way to keep prices down and reduce costs is negotiated prices. Yes, it's true that in the Republican alternative, there's some effort to cap out-of-pocket costs. There's some effort to deal with the inflation factor. But discussions have never been possible with the Republican side about negotiating prices. They're just opposed to that. And Mrs. Rogers mentioned government price setting. This is not government price setting. This is a capitalist competitive approach. It's basically saying, look, we're buying all this stuff from you, and so we want a better price. That's what negotiation is all about. It doesn't set the price. It says, look, I'm buying all this stuff from you, just like you go to a department store, everything else. I'm going to buy a lot of stuff. You got to give me a break. I mean, that's all it is. That's the essence of capitalism, in my opinion. That's what I perceive as capitalism.
I'd say to my friend, Mr. Pallone, you're absolutely right. And I can tell you the people in Colorado, that it's a complete no-brainer. And to try to confuse it and say, oh no, negotiation prices, give me a break.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a desperation in the Republican arguments today that I haven't heard in a long time. So let me move to something else. I want to move to the climate change piece of this thing, because that's something else that is just front and center in the minds of the people that I represent. We get the smoke from the fires in Washington. And, my people want us to do something about that. And we are taking dramatic steps in this bill to provide incentives to manufacturers, unlike what Ms. McMorris Rogers was saying, for manufacturers to make solar panels here, to make the windmills here, to do the biomass here, to really advance renewable energy. And we incentivize Americans to buy that stuff so that we can change the direction that our climate is going to just get hotter and drier and hotter and drier. Mr. Pallone, you want to comment on that?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. Look, the approach here is totally incentivizing things. It is not mandating or regulating, it's incentivizing. That's what the approach here is. So you're absolutely right. when Mrs. Rogers talks about China, and I agree with her that China's what we got to watch out with, Beijing certainly. And they have kind of cornered the supply chain. They make more solar panels, they make more of the parts for the windmills, but we need to turn that around. And the only way you're going to turn it around is by giving these, investment credits and incentives to develop the capacity for that domestic manufacturing and the components needed for clean energy tech. So, don't let China lead the energy transition. Let us lead it. Let us take that back and create the jobs that are involved in it. And the one other thing, I know you didn't mention it, but Mr. Cole and Mrs. Rogers mentioned methane. That is not, there's no tax on methane. There's no tax on gas. It's an incentive to drive down excess methane pollution. So basically, it says that it establishes a methane waste emissions threshold for petroleum and gas, and then applies a charge for waste emissions exceeding those thresholds, right? And so it's not a tax, it's a charge that only applies like a fee to wasted methane above these thresholds. So again, it's an incentive. If you want to pollute and you want to pay more, fine. Hopefully, I don't know that anybody would, but we're trying to say, look, we'll set a threshold. We want you to stop wasting all this methane. I mean, I don't want to keep talking, but if you drive down the turnpike in my district and at night you see those flares from the refineries that people comment about. Well, we want to capture that stuff. We want to capture it and reuse it. Why
Well,
should we let it into the atmosphere?
all right, so let me just take that one step farther, and then I've got some other questions. In Colorado, wells that have been drilled in and around the Denver area and throughout our state. We're an energy producing state, but the wells often leak methane.
Exactly.
And there is a tremendous opportunity. And we've actually, in a couple of science hearings, have had testimony from businesses that detect the methane. This will help incentivize more of that kind of research and manufacturing. And then when you detect the methane, one, you get the pollution out of the air and you keep the gas in the pipeline or at the well so that those guys can sell it. So the arguments that I heard concerning methane are completely crazy.
Absolutely. And
Crazy.
again, most of people think that greenhouse gas emissions are mostly from utilities, coal firing. But when we had the climate conference last year that I went to, I don't know where it was. I can't remember. Oh, in Glasgow. Um, the big emphasis was on methane. That is a major source of the warming of the planet. And why not capture it and reuse it? I mean, and provide an incentive to do that. Why not?
So two other things in this section, and then I want to turn to Mr. Yarmouth to talk about sort of the financial and economic component of some of the arguments that I've just heard. But in the bill, we have a major piece of litigation going on with respect to a very big rural electric co-op here in Colorado, where the membership of the co-op would like to advance in terms of their energy production and incorporate more renewable energy. But the co-op still has a lot of coal-fired and sort of legacy type of utilities. This bill helps both the co-op and the member that would like to get further ahead in using renewables by providing incentives for those rural electric co-ops to do renewable energy, and may, I got to look at it a little closer, may help resolve this conflict that exists between this big co-op and one of its major members. That's one thing I wanted to point out. And to Miss McMorris Rogers, as a Westerner here, there in this bill is $4 billion to deal with the drought that all of us have suffered in the West. Some years it's a little worse than other years, but there is a major piece dealing with the sort of drought mitigation in this particular piece of legislation, and it's dedicated to the West. So for when you guys are having your fires or we're having ours, we want to deal with that, and this bill provides that. Now, the last thing I want to talk is to Mr. Yarmouth. Miss McMorris Rogers really caught my attention in her testimony today. So she was, as I see this thing, there's finally a tax on the biggest corporations that haven't been paying tax on profits over $1 billion. I mean, this is not Mrs. McGillicuddy who lives down at the end of the street. This is maybe, I don't know, Apple or Amazon. I don't know who they are, but they got to make $1 billion, and it's setting a minimum in profit, and it sets a minimum tax. But all of a sudden, I was hearing, well, this doesn't do anything for inflation. Inflation's way up. It's going to get worse under this bill. Everyday Americans are going to be punished by this bill. And, I had a telephone town hall Monday night. We had 10,000 people on that call. We did a poll about this bill, kind of laid it out. Now, maybe I laid it out a little bit, in a I think I laid it out in a neutral fashion, but you're never sure about that. But 57% of the people on the call supported the bill, 24% did not, and 19% didn't know. And looking at some of the polling across the country, we've seen similar numbers that Americans really understand that this is good for the climate, it's good for healthcare, and it's good for the federal budget. So, Mr. Yarmouth, I know you had some thoughts about some of the remarks by Ms. McMorris Rogers.
Well, thank you, Mr. Perlmutter, and fellow lame duck. It's good to be with you. That's one of the problems with this whole discussion today, and we've been through it time and time again, is that statements are made which are designed only to scare people with absolutely no validation, no underlying documentation. Ms. McMorris Rogers just said 2 minutes ago that people are now spending 20% of their income on energy and food costs, and that could go to 50%. Now, that is an outrageous statement. I defy her to come up with any documentation that would even come close to that analysis. If inflation is in fact 8.5% on she was talking about a $50,000 income family, that's $4,000 a year, 4,000 plus. That's the total inflation. So how in the world does that go from increase that portion of her expenditure from an additional $4,000 to $15,000 a year, which is what she was implying. And it's just that you can't just scare people and expect that democracy can survive realistically when you're told to make such irresponsible statements. There is absolutely no basis. When I debated in high school, if you made a statement like that and against me, and I would challenge you, I would win the debate automatically, because that was basically you couldn't support the statement you made. In politics, you don't have to support the statement you made. One of the things that, again, this whole nonsense about drug companies and life-saving drugs being foregone because of we're going to negotiate prices with them. I just ran these numbers last week. The top 10 drug companies in the country in 2021 had net income total of over $250 billion. That wasn't business. That wasn't gross income. That was profit. You're telling me that if we negotiate, let's say 10% or 20% discount on the drugs they sell us, that they're all of a sudden going to stop their R&D efforts when they have so much money they don't know what to do with? All of this defies logic. I mean, I watch the ads. We see them all in D.C. The big pharma ads trying to criticize this bill. They fought this negotiation provision going back to 2004. And sure, they don't like it. They want to set prices wherever they can set them. They want to set insulin prices at 20, 30, 40 times what any reasonable amount would be. I looked at Pfizer. Pfizer has provided a great service to the country in developing the vaccine. And by the way, we helped them do that. Last quarter, Pfizer reported $11.4 billion in profit. $11.4 billion in profit in one quarter. Now, would that have been if we had negotiated a different price with them, the 20% less, 30% less, and by the way, the government, the taxpayers paid for most of these, most of the vaccines. Would that have hurt them? Would it have kept any life-saving drugs off the market? Of course not. This is just ludicrous. So let's get real. Let's face the facts that there are certain things that right now in this economy that are easily fixable, that only huge money going to politicians prevent us from doing that. One of them is lowering prescription drug prices. This bill, for the first time, again, since 2004, does something to help the consumer of pharmaceuticals. And we just need to be honest about that. And I wish we could have the kind of responsible debate that could result in much more logical and effective policies.
I've got one last question, and this is for Mr. Byer. You know, there's been criticism of the title of this Inflation Reduction Act. But from my vantage point, and especially after having discussed it on this telephone town hall for a long time, where the questions were posed, you know, how does it reduce inflation? I can certainly see it reducing inflation in the energy arena. I see it reducing costs in the healthcare. But Mr. Byer, how do you see it?
Well, Mr. Perlmutter, thank you very much. You know, I'm not a PhD economist, but I'm surrounded by them on the Joint Economic Committee. And I was in the business for 46 years. And just simply, when you reduce the budget deficit, as this bill does, that's anti-inflationary. And when you raise taxes on corporations making more than $1 billion, that is anti-inflationary. And when you bring down the cost of all fossil fuels by the electrification of automobility, by all the new electrical cars that are not buying gas, that brings down inflation. And when you cut the cost of prescription drugs, that brings down inflation. Almost every part of this bill is moving us in the right direction. We're already at 0.0% month over month, and we hope much more of that will come. By the way, my friend, the ranking member Ways and Means, was pulling my leg about negotiating with cars. Before I was in public service, I sold many cars to the U.S. Department of Transportation. They used to crush them in crash testing, and we would always negotiate. And the nice part was that if we would negotiate, that they walk away. But you never don't want to negotiate. This is the whole idea of business. You have to get to yes. So this so-called high tax only kicks in that rare case, or perhaps non-existent case, of people refusing to negotiate. And one more factoid. I read today that U.S. pharmacy profits in the last year exceeded worldwide global R&D for all businesses. So this is not about cost recovery. Cost recovery happens way, way, way long time ago in the profit curve.
I thank the gentleman. I yield back to the chair.